By the late 1930s, while Europe stood on the edge of another devastating war, a quiet revolution was unfolding along Germany's Baltic coastline. Hidden behind military checkpoints and layers of secrecy was the Peenemünde Army Research Center, a facility so classified that even many high-ranking officers had little understanding of what was being built there. From the outside, it looked like just another test ground. In reality, it was the birthplace of a weapon that would change warfare forever. Inside these guarded fences worked a young engineer whose ambitions reached far beyond the battlefield. Werner von Braun was not originally driven by dreams of destruction. Since childhood, he had been captivated by the idea of space travel. He read visionary scientific texts, conducted amateur rocket experiments, and imagined a future where humanity would journey beyond Earth. But history has a way of bending dreams toward darker purposes. When the German army recognized the military potential of rocket technology, von Braun's passion was swiftly absorbed into the machinery of war. Under the supervision of the Wehrmacht, his team began developing a rocket known as the Aggregat 4, or A4. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Traditional artillery relied on predictable arcs and limited range. Aircraft required pilots and could be shot down. But this new creation would rise vertically, climb into the upper atmosphere, and descend faster than the speed of sound. There would be no warning before impact, only the explosion itself. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels later renamed it the Vergeltungswaffe II, the V-2, meaning Vengeance Weapon 2. The name was deliberate. Germany wanted the world to understand that this was not simply a weapon, it was retaliation made mechanical, fear engineered into steel. The early years were filled with failure. Rockets exploded seconds after launch, engines malfunctioned, guidance systems drifted off course, and prototypes shattered into burning debris. Engineers watched months of calculations vanish in towering fireballs. Yet each disaster provided data, and data meant progress. Von Braun insisted on relentless refinement. Every component had to function perfectly, from turbopumps forcing propellant into the combustion chamber to the delicate gyroscopes guiding the missile through near space. The rocket ran on a volatile combination of liquid oxygen and alcohol fuel. When ignited, the engine produced roughly 56,000 pounds of thrust, enough to shake the ground beneath observers. Witnesses described test launches as almost supernatural. One engineer later wrote that standing nearby felt like watching the Earth defy gravity. Then came the breakthrough. On October 3, 1942, an A4 rocket roared off the launch pad and climbed higher than any human-made object before it. It traveled nearly 120 miles into the sky, crossing what many scientists recognize as the boundary of space, before plunging back toward Earth. In that moment, without ceremony or global recognition, humanity had entered the space age, not through exploration, but through conflict. When Adolf Hitler saw the footage, his skepticism toward rocket programs reportedly vanished. Germany, once confident in swift victories, was beginning to sense the strain of a prolonged war. The Eastern Front was bleeding manpower. Allied bombers were devastating German industry. The promise of a revolutionary weapon was intoxicating. Hitler began referring to advanced arms as Wunderwaffen, miracle weapons that could reverse Germany's fortunes. But designing the V-2 was only half the battle. Manufacturing it proved vastly more difficult. Each missile required thousands of precision-engineered parts and advanced materials at a time when German factories were under constant attack. Skilled labor was dwindling, resources were stretched thin across multiple fronts. Still, the regime refused to slow production. After Allied reconnaissance identified Peenemünde as a critical site, the British launched Operation Hydra in August 1943. Hundreds of bombers filled the night sky, unloading destruction across the facility. Explosions tore through laboratories and living quarters alike. Scientists were killed, infrastructure burned. For a brief moment, it seemed the rocket program might be crippled beyond recovery. Instead, the attack forced the Nazis to move production underground into a vast tunnel network carved into the Kohnstein mountain. The new facility was called Mittelwerk. It was safe from bombs, but at an unthinkable human cost. The workforce consisted largely of concentration camp transfers from nearby Mittelbau-Dora. They labored in suffocating tunnels filled with dust and chemical fumes, often working 18-hour shifts with little food or medical care. Brutality was routine. Collapse meant execution. Disease spread quickly in the darkness. Historians estimate that more than 20,000 prisoners died building the V-2, a number that exceeds the casualties caused by the rocket itself. Some engineers privately wrestled with the moral implications, yet the culture of Nazi Germany left little room for dissent. The program had become too important, too symbolic of technological supremacy to question openly. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence struggled to understand what Germany was preparing. Aerial photographs showed unusual launch structures along the French coast. Resistance fighters reported strange cylindrical cargo moving only at night. Analysts suspected a new long-range weapon, but debated its nature. Was it an advanced bomber? A pilotless aircraft? Few imagined a ballistic missile descending from the edge of space. By 1944, the strategic situation for Germany had deteriorated further. Allied forces were pushing west after D-Day. Soviet armies advanced relentlessly from the east. Cities lay in ruins. Morale was fracturing. The V-2 was no longer just a weapon. It was a psychological lifeline for leadership desperate to demonstrate power. Finally, in September 1944, the world witnessed the result. Without warning, a rocket slammed into Paris. Another struck London. There was no approaching engine noise, no aircraft silhouette against the clouds. 1 second the streets were ordinary, the next they were engulfed in smoke and shattered stone. People searched the sky in confusion. Air raid sirens had not sounded because radar detected nothing in time. The explosion came first, the sound followed. For civilians, the experience was profoundly unsettling. During earlier bombing campaigns, at least there had been moments to seek shelter. The V-2 erased that illusion of control. Death arrived faster than human reaction. British officials quickly grasped the severity of the development. When Prime Minister Churchill was briefed, analysts explained that interception was effectively impossible with existing technology. No fighter could climb fast enough. No anti-aircraft gun could track something descending at supersonic speed. Germany had introduced a weapon that rendered traditional defense obsolete. Yet beneath the terror lay a critical truth, one that few in the Nazi leadership were willing to confront. The V-2 was extraordinarily advanced, but it was also extraordinarily expensive. Each missile consumed resources that Germany could scarcely afford: rare metals, specialized electronics, vast quantities of fuel, and complex manufacturing capacity. From a purely strategic standpoint, the missile delivered relatively small payloads compared to the cost of producing it. Still, belief can be more powerful than arithmetic. Nazi propaganda portrayed the V-2 as unstoppable, a symbol of inevitable German resurgence. Newspapers spoke of secret technologies that would force the Allies to negotiate. Engineers were told their work could decide the fate of the war, and many believed it. But even as the rockets rose into the stratosphere, another reality was taking shape far beyond Peenemunde's laboratories and Mittelwerk's tunnels. Allied factories were producing aircraft by the tens of thousands. American shipyards launched vessels at unprecedented speed. Soviet industry, relocated east of the Urals, continued to outproduce German armor. The V-2 represented brilliance, but it was brilliance standing alone against overwhelming industrial power. What the scientists did not yet fully grasp is that technological superiority means little without strategic balance.
A single revolutionary weapon cannot compensate for collapsing supply lines, shrinking territory, and an enemy growing stronger by the month. Soon, the very rocket intended to secure Germany's future would become evidence of a deeper desperation, because the question was no longer whether the V-2 could terrify cities. The question was whether terror itself could still change the outcome of a war that was already slipping beyond Germany's control.
By the winter of 1944, the V-2 rocket had transformed from an experimental marvel into an operational weapon of war. Launch crews, trained in secrecy and precision, moved constantly across occupied Europe using mobile platforms designed to fire and disappear before Allied aircraft could locate them. Forest clearings, abandoned roads, and concealed concrete pads became temporary gateways to the edge of space. Each launch followed a tense and methodical ritual. Convoys arrived under darkness. The massive rocket, nearly 46 feet tall, was slowly raised into a vertical position. Fueling was the most dangerous stage. Liquid oxygen, cold enough to freeze steel brittle, had to be pumped carefully into the missile, while alcohol fuel followed through a separate system. One spark, one faulty valve could incinerate the entire crew. Soldiers often describe the minutes before ignition as unbearably quiet. Then came the command. The engine roared alive with a blinding plume, and the rocket clawed upward, accelerating so rapidly that within seconds it was only a streak vanishing into the heavens. At its peak altitude, often above 50 miles, the missile followed a ballistic arc toward its target. No human guided it after launch. Gravity finished the mission. For those on the ground in London or Antwerp, the experience defied comprehension. Survivors frequently reported hearing the explosion before the sound of the rocket itself. The shockwave shattered windows blocks away, while entire buildings seemed to collapse inward as if crushed by an invisible force. Psychologically, the weapon achieved exactly what its creators intended: uncertainty. There was no pattern, no warning, no defense strategy civilians could rely upon. Newspapers were heavily censored to prevent panic, yet rumors spread faster than official statements. Some believed the Germans had developed a weapon that traveled through the upper atmosphere. Others whispered about technologies bordering on science fiction. In truth, it was something even more unsettling. Science had simply advanced to the point where imagination struggled to keep pace. Between September 1944 and March 1945, more than 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched against Allied territory. London bore the brunt, but the Belgian port of Antwerp became an equally critical target. The harbor was essential for supplying Allied armies pushing into Western Europe, and German planners hoped relentless bombardment would cripple the logistical lifeline. At times, rockets struck crowded cinemas, residential neighborhoods, and marketplaces. One impact at the Rex Cinema in Antwerp killed hundreds in seconds. Yet despite the destruction, the broader military effect remained limited. The rockets were terrifying, but not precise. Early guidance systems relied on gyroscopes and primitive onboard computers that calculated engine cutoff timing. A slight miscalculation could shift the impact point by miles. Accuracy was sacrificed for innovation. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining the program continued to escalate. A single V-2 required enormous industrial effort, resources that might otherwise have produced fighter aircraft, tanks, or defensive artillery. German commanders increasingly debated whether the weapon was strategically rational or merely technologically impressive. But inside Hitler's inner circle, doubt was rarely voiced aloud. The Führer clung to the belief that revolutionary weapons could fracture Allied morale. If cities could be terrorized into paralysis, perhaps political pressure would follow, perhaps negotiations might emerge. It was a hope rooted less in strategy than in desperation. Across the Channel, Allied scientists and intelligence officers raced to understand the missile. Crash sites were immediately secured, fragments were catalogued, measured, and shipped to laboratories. Analysts reconstructed fuel systems, guidance mechanisms, and structural design with astonishing speed. One conclusion became unavoidable: stopping the rocket mid-air was impossible. Instead, the Allies shifted focus towards eliminating launch capabilities altogether. Fighter bombers patrolled suspected transport routes. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed forests and rail lines. Resistance networks relayed movements of unusual convoys. Yet the mobility of launch teams made them elusive targets. Even when a site was identified, by the time bombs fell, the crews were often gone, leaving nothing but scorched earth. Ironically, the most effective method of reducing V-2 attacks came not from technological countermeasures, but from territorial advance. As Allied armies liberated France and Belgium, they physically overran launch zones, forcing German units to retreat deeper into shrinking territory. Geography, not engineering, became the rocket's greatest limitation. Back in Germany, however, another realization was beginning to take hold, especially among the scientists. Werner Braun understood mathematics as well as anyone alive. He could calculate trajectories, thrust ratios, and structural loads with elegant precision. And those same analytic instincts made one truth increasingly obvious: Germany was running out of time. Fuel shortages plagued transportation. Cities burned under relentless bombing. Experienced pilots were irreplaceable. The Eastern Front devoured divisions faster than they could be rebuilt. Even if the V-2 represented a leap decades ahead of its era, it could not reverse the collapse unfolding across multiple fronts. Some engineers quietly shifted their thinking towards the future rather than the present war. They began contemplating how rocket technology might serve peaceful exploration once the conflict ended, though few dared speak such thoughts publicly. Braun himself reportedly remarked to a colleague, "The rocket worked perfectly, except for landing on the wrong planet." It was a rare moment of dark humor, masking a deeper awareness that technological brilliance had been harnessed to a doomed cause. By early 1945, the Third Reich was contracting rapidly. Soviet artillery thundered toward Berlin. Western allies crossed the Rhine. Rail networks disintegrated. Communication faltered. Yet launches continued, not because they would win the war, but because the machinery had already been set in motion. Inside Mittelwerk, prisoners still assembled rockets under horrific conditions, even as distant artillery hinted that liberation might be approaching. Guards grew harsher, aware that the end could bring accountability. For the scientists, a new fear emerged, not of defeat, but of capture. Both the United States and the Soviet Union recognized the V-2 as more than a weapon. It was the foundation of future missile technology. Whoever secured the expertise behind it would possess a strategic advantage for decades. Suddenly, the rocket engineers became prizes. Braun and several colleagues made a quiet, calculated decision. They would attempt to surrender to American forces rather than fall into Soviet hands. It was a choice shaped partly by ideology, partly by survival instinct, and partly by the belief that the United States would allow them to continue their research. As Allied troops closed in, the engineers gathered technical documents, hid critical research, and prepared for a dangerous journey south through a collapsing Germany. The war that had once empowered their work was now something they needed to escape. Meanwhile, the rockets kept falling, each a launch reminder of what human ingenuity could achieve and how tragically it could be used. Yet history was already delivering its verdict. For all its speed, for all its terror, for all the awe it inspired, the V-2 could not alter the fundamental balance of the conflict. Wars are not won by single inventions alone, no matter how revolutionary. They're decided by industry, logistics, manpower, leadership, and the slow accumulation of strategic advantage. Germany had built a weapon from the future, but it was fighting a war it could no longer sustain. And soon, as the front lines collapsed and the architects of the rocket scattered in search of surrender, the world would witness a final, profound irony. The technology created to secure Nazi victory would instead ignite the global space race, carried forward not by the regime that conceived it, but by the very nations it had tried to defeat.